Hi everyone, my name is Srushti Jayant Deshmukh. So we were discussing the general studies papers, and in that segment now we'll move on to the general studies paper 3. So let's just pick up questions one by one. Excuse me for the bad throat. The first question is, access to affordable, reliable, sustainable and modern energy is the sine qua non to achieve sustainable developmental goal. Comment on the progress made in India in this regard. Look at the focus of the question. They are just giving you an overall theme that sustainable developmental goal we have to achieve. But the focus of the question is to comment on the progress made in India. So it's exclusively about India and not in general. Telling you about this question, sustainable developmental goals are so much in use. And I always say that you can use it in your conclusion framework. So, and you got a direct question from sustainable development goal. So they are extremely important. While I read this question, what was moving in my mind was that the sustainable developmental goal number 7 is something related to power and energy. So I read the words access to affordable, something that all can afford, reliable, it continues, then sustainable, it's not harmful to the environment, and modern energy. So I think the kind of a linkage of the question is actually towards renewable energy. The bent of the question is towards renewable energy, modern energy. And so I started by simply saying that sustainable developmental goals are something which are very important for us. How they play a big role in not only the environment but also for overall development. That I wrote in the intro because I knew that the entire answer is going to be specifically on energy. So I opened up with this and then I moved on to energy. And commenting on the progress in India especially means that you're also going to substantiate your points by supporting them with the example of government schemes. So I had a lot of government schemes coming in my mind at that moment, like the first one, Ujjwala scheme for LPG providing to poor women households, that is there. So I quoted Ujjwala. Then Ujala, Ujala is something related to the LED. Unnat Jyoti, affordable LED for all. That is Ujala. So these schemes I quoted in the body of the answer. Ujjwala, Ujala. And one of the most important things in global context, if you're talking about energy, is the International Solar Alliance, which India has initiated. So that is something I specifically mentioned. And I also talked about Kusum. This scheme is actually for promoting solar pumps in our country. So this is also a pertinent scheme here. So I first of all gave a brief idea that yes, I recognize that India is making good progress in this regard. But then before ending the answer, I also said that India needs to do much more. Even today, the coal is playing a big role in our energy utilization. That was asked in last year. So before I could conclude the answer, I said that yes, some negatives remain. We need to make greater progress. It's not that we are completely on the right track, but there are certain loopholes which need to be filled. For example, in the solar energy, the manufacturing of solar panels does not largely happen in our country because of the absence of raw materials. So these are some of the drawbacks which we need to work upon. I summed up the answer there. Moving on to the next question, comment on the important changes introduced in respect of the long-term capital gains tax and dividend distribution tax in the union budget for 2018-19. See, this question is directly coming from the union budget. So as we also always say that economic survey and the budget of India is something that you all should read really properly. And because they directly pick questions from there, and I was lucky enough that I had read something about it. So I comment is the important changes introduced. So I just gave a brief introduction about the union budget because you can't do much. It's a 10 marker. So and then I directly moved on to what is long-term capital gains tax. I just wrote about the percentage that is there and how much tax and what is actually the reason behind which such tax is being introduced. Okay. So I tried to mention the reasons behind the long-term capital gains tax, that anybody who is gaining a long-term capital gain, any gain which is happening on a long term, how it will actually also contribute, should also contribute to the economy of the country. Those were some of the reasons I quoted, and then I moved on to the dividend distribution tax. So the dividend that a person would get out of any investment, that is also something I elaborated upon at a brief level. This was a very straightforward question, so there was not much scope to elaborate and make up, so I left it there. The third question is about what do you mean by minimum support price, and how will MSP rescue the farmers from the low income trap? See, this question has two parts, and one thing that came to my mind when I read this question was back to basics. See, whenever we read General Studies Paper 3, MSP is something which we read as a very basic thing. MSP, what is it and how does it help out? So we don't read it at an applicable level. But here UPSC is asking you to go back to basics and just explain to them plainly what is MSP. So I just explained what is MSP, a kind of a support price that is provided to the farmers. See, in questions where you get more than one part or like two parts here, you need to do justice to both the parts, and it depends on the demand of the question how much space you're taking to write for both the parts. So here, what do you mean by MSP is one part, and the other is how will MSP rescue the farmers. Now, how will MSP rescue the farmers is something that this scope we can talk about in good number of points. So I started with what do you mean? Very briefly, 1/3 of the answer. I tried to explain what is MSP, how is it a policy in order to support the income of the farmers, and how it actually makes sure that farmers are not affected by the markets going up and down, and how that agricultural marketing how MSP is helpful to the farmers. That explained in the first part. In the second part, how will MSP rescue? In this, yes, I'd also like to mention, I also mentioned the name of CSEP, the Commission for Agricultural Cost and Prices, which is actually determining, the agency which determines and gives this MSP and calculates it. So that also you can write. I also wrote in the second part of the answer, I wrote how will MSP rescue the farmers from the low income trap. Anybody who's having a low income and anybody who's having low productivity of the land, even with that low productivity, whatever he's producing, if he's going to the market or he's going to the agri mandi and he's selling it for a minimum price, then at least he will have something for himself. So this is the part that I emphasized, that poverty alleviation could also happen, low income trap could actually break in. But then whenever we talk about MSP, we also see how MSP is also going into a negative trend. Maybe the large farmers are taking all the benefit of MSP and it's not reaching the small farmers. Okay, so at the end, before ending the answer, I also mentioned the negative impact, that how due to MSP some particular crops are only being produced, okay, and how it is also harming the environment impact. These are some of the negatives. So we should also be recognizing that MSP is not one-stop solution, and there are also some loopholes in it. So that is what I try to do. Moving on to the next question, number 4. Examine the role of supermarkets in supply chain management of fruits, vegetables and food items. How do they eliminate number of intermediaries? Again, this question is a very basic one, and it has two parts. First part says, examine the role of supermarkets in supply chain management of fruits, vegetables and food items. See, this question is very much related to the food processing sector. So this time they didn't ask any direct question on food processing, they're asking you an indirect question, but the matter remains more or less the same. They're asking us, examine the role of supermarket. How does the supermarket say? How does it help? And the key word here is, mind you, the key word is examine. When I read examine, I thought I also need to provide not only the positives but also the negatives. So I opened up the answer by telling what is supply chain management. What is supply chain management? I explained it right since the production of a particular item until it reaches through the intermediaries to the customers. The entire chain is supply chain management. And then I tried to analyze positively the role of supermarkets. That the supermarkets are helping the farmers to connect to the larger audience, suppose in urban area. They are also taking care of the logistic and everything behind that. So those were the positive. But since the keyword was examine, I also tried to mention the negative, how supermarkets, how they can have a negative impact. They can have some kind of a monopoly. Maybe the prices that they are paying might not be up to the mark. So some kind of negatives, whatever I could think of at that moment. And lastly, the question is, the sub part is, how do they eliminate the number of intermediaries? See, if you underline the word intermediaries, intermediaries always have had a negative impact on this. See, we always say that increasing number of intermediaries would actually, draw the money out of the pocket of the farmer, the more intermediaries there are. So I said, if a person is actually connected, a farmer is connected to a supermarket, then he doesn't have to go for a farm gate sale, what we call it a farm gate sale, that going for sale of your item at your farm gate. This will not happen. And I also tried to list out if intermediaries are not there, then the the income of the farmers, the income which is there with the farmers will also increase at some point. And maybe if the supermarkets directly actually link with the farmer, then every year they can ensure that there's some buyer for their products produced. So that is a positive thing for farmers. These are some of the things, and I adequately concluded by saying that the food processing industry should also be promoted. Supermarkets should not only be taking only the raw products, but they should also help the farmers in processing the food so that they can get better value for their products. Moving on to the next question, and this one was really tricky. Discuss the work of Bose-Einstein statistics done by Professor Satyendranath Bose and show how it revolutionized the field of physics. See, I'll tell you, this particular question, and there are bound to be questions like this in the exam. There are bound to be questions, no matter how much we study, we would come across certain questions which we have least idea about, which we might have never even heard of. But the actual thing, the actual competition is about being able to attempt something even in those questions, so that we don't leave that space blank and give that kind of a negative impression on the examiner. So I read this question, discuss the work of Bose-Einstein statistics done by Professor Satyendranath Bose and show how it revolutionized. So I had heard something about Bose-Einstein statistics, a kind of a combined work that they had come out with, and I couldn't think about much in this answer. So I just tried to say that both of these scientists were very they were very important for the field of physics and science in totality. And like the Einstein has his own theory of relativity, Satyendranath Bose also worked on a particular particle, and I knew this was something related to quantum particles or some particular particle being discovered. So I just tried to weave my answer around it. Honestly, this was a question where I was tricked, but I knew that I had to write something. So I weaved an answer, and since it's specifically given how it revolutionized the field of physics, I tried to connect it. I had this thing that there was another state of matter that was being discovered. So I tried to include that as a point. I'm not sure at what level it was being evaluated, but I would just say that you are bound to get questions which you don't know, but you should be at least be able to write something or make some flowchart or diagram that you can in such answers. Moving on to question number 6. What are the impediments of disposing the huge quantities of discarded solid waste which are continuously being generated? That's the first part of the question. Note the part, it says what are the impediments in disposing. Okay. The second is, how do we remove safely the toxic wastes that have been accumulating in our habitable environment. So first is about impediments, and then we have to talk about how to remove. I noted one fact in this question, that the word India was not mentioned. So if the word India is not mentioned, then this question has to be at a global level. You can't be talking about India only when you're writing this answer, because the word India is nowhere mentioned. So they're expecting you to write a global answer. And in that context, I started by the increasing amount of discarded solid waste in the world. So I had some data which I had taken up from the United Nations Environment Program website, UNEP. I quoted the data for the huge quantity of solid waste being generated. And this was just actually trying to agree with the question, trying to agree that yes, we recognize that the solid waste is increasing. And then after this, mentioning this in the introduction, giving the data. Then I moved on to the impediments. What are the impediments in disposing? So first of all, mentioning the metric tons of waste that's generated, and then impediments in disposing. First impediment that was coming to my mind at that moment, that the waste is all mixed up. Separation of waste at source is not there. So I think that could be the first which came to my mind. Mixed up waste, especially in the context of solid waste. All the waste is mixed up and we don't know what's happening. So that's the first one. Secondly, lack of adequate technology or trained manpower. And lack of resource allocation by the government. Recently in the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, we are paying attention to it, but in general in countries we can't say that the government is putting all the resources in this direction. So lack of government resources is also one point here. I tried to list out some impediments that were coming to my mind in the first part of the answer, and then I moved on, and I felt the second part was also equally, and if not more, equally important. How do we remove safely the toxic waste that have been accumulating? Note the word toxic. They are not asking you how to remove the solid waste, but the toxic waste. So amongst the solid waste, whatever toxic waste which is there, how do we remove that? Maybe that is the question. So when I was thinking about toxic waste, I thought about medical waste is toxic, which is coming from the hospitals, that is toxic. Then suppose we have syringes, cottons, all of that. Biomedical waste is toxic. Then you have glass, and then you have heavy metals, molybdenum or cadmium coming from sulfur acid batteries. So these could be really toxic for the environment. How to remove? I then mentioned the specific examples from India. See, I had given an overall brief idea of in the world, but now I just tried to orient my answer a little bit towards India, because we are studying for our country also. So I tried to mention how in India we had recently drafted the biomedical waste policy, the policy which tells us how we have to treat that waste, then about glass, then about metals. I just tried to give a brief idea of any waste which I felt is toxic in nature. And in the conclusion, I adequately concluded this answer by actually mentioning that this waste is leading to pollution, leading to degradation of environment, and then I connected this to the sustainable development goal, that if we need to actually achieve SDG, we need to be taking care of the pollution aspects. Moving on to the next question, what is wetland? Question number 7, what is wetland? Explain the Ramsar concept of wise use in the context of wetland conservation. Cite 2 examples of Ramsar sites in India. See, this particular question again reminds me and I was reminded that UPSC is asking very basic questions like what is wetland. This is something we read in prelims, and then we just don't pay attention to it so much. So they are just trying to, I think, get into the basic also. So what is wetlands? Try to define it. That wetland is a kind of water body where water is generally stagnant, and all the things that we study, that in wetland there is a high amount of biodiversity which is there. That's also one comparison point that we take when we are comparing it with a lake. So increased amount of biodiversity is also there. That's how I just tried to tell about a wetland. Then it is asking, explain the Ramsar concept of wise use in the context of wetland conservation. Now what I felt was, very recently there was a change in the wetland management rules, and there wise use concept was given to the states to take care of, and I think that is why the question was asked. This was something on expected lines, because I had read the the wetland management rule changes in India, and so I just tried to explain what is wise use. See, in such questions you may not have read the Ramsar, since I had not read the Ramsar convention per se, but what could be wise use? Wise use is something which does not harm a wetland. So I just tried to list these points one by one. Not harming the biodiversity, and preventing eutrophication. All of these things I try to write. Okay, how wise use is something without harming the health of the wetland. I just try to list out some points of it and try to cover major. I think the major part of the answer here is the second part. Explain the Ramsar concept of wise use, because one part we answered wetland is just the definition, and the last part, cite 2 examples of Ramsar sites from India. Very straightforward question, something like prelims question. So see, anyway I would have written just 1 and 2. What I did briefly, I just drew the map of India quickly at the end of the answer, and here I located 2 Ramsar sites, one here in Assam, Deepor Beel, and one here in central India, Bhoj wetland. So I just drew the map of India and tried to locate. I think maybe this would have fetched me 1/2 or half mark extra, because the presentation of that is important. So I felt if you could use such presentation, it could also bring up a little goodness in the answer. Moving to the next question. Sikkim is the first organic state in India. What are the ecological and economical benefits of organic state? Again, a very well drafted question coming from the current affairs, because organic state or organic farming was something very much in use. So, and we all know that Sikkim is the first organic state in India. See, that is just a statement. Question is not that. Question is, what are the ecological and economical benefits of organic state? Since the entire question is going to be about organic farming and organic thing, in the definition, I just, in the opening, in the introduction, I just tried to define what organic farming was. Alright. So organic farming could be a farming in which you're not using artificial pesticides and fertilizers, but you're using the natural resources for farming purposes. So I mentioned that what is organic farming. Then I also mentioned one statement that Sikkim is the only state in the country which has been designated. So we are actually supporting, yes, we are accepting what is given in the question. And then I moved on straight to the ecological and economic. Since these 2 key terms in the question are very clear, ecological and economical. So I divided my answer into 2 parts. I started from ecological benefit, made a box, and tried to just bring out one by one in just point manner, because it is a 10 marker. You don't have scope to write too much here. So writing all the points is extremely important. So I covered the ecological points one by one, how it will not harm the environment. It will help the idea of sustainable development. The degradation of the soil could be prevented. it could be prevented, it could be brought down. So all of these were points which I added in the ecological side. Coming to the economic benefits. Coming to the economic, this is the second part of the answer, the second half. So economic, I just tried to write down how economically this tag could benefit, because if a particular state is producing organic products, then its products will be famous in the entire country. So I mentioned how revenue could be earned. I also tried to connect it to the exports that Sikkim can do now, and if it gets approved by the European regulations, then Sikkim could also export its products in other countries like Europe and United States, etc. So export was one factor. And since the question is not specifically on Sikkim, Sikkim is just mentioned as a passing reference. So I did not mention Sikkim again and again, but these were points that I was thinking at that moment. I also tried to mention that how other states can learn. Here a very important point is also how farmers will benefit, how the earning of the farmers will go up, and at a sustainable level. While concluding the answer, I wrote that organic farming is the best example of how sustainably we can enhance the income of the farmers, because it is only with sustainable farming like organic farming where we can ensure that the crops are being grown or the soil's productivity is restored for years to come. Otherwise you are exploiting the soil right now, and in the further years the productivity might go down. So it is in the best interest of everyone, not only the farmers but the state and the country, that organic farming is promoted. This is how I concluded it, with a broad vision in mind. Moving on to the next question. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is viewed as a cardinal subset of China's larger OBOR, that is a One Belt One Road initiative. Give a brief description of CPEC and enumerate the reasons why India has distanced itself from the same. When I read this question, I thought this is a big question, and it is a 150 words answer. So let's break this up. Try and understand the first statement is just a statement, it's not a question. It is CPEC is viewed as a cardinal subset. Note the word cardinal subset of China's OBOR. Cardinal means something very important, subset means a part of it. So I felt they are just trying to tell you that CPEC is important. Okay, got it. Moving on, give a brief description of CPEC. That's first part. First is brief description of CPEC and enumerate the reason. Note the key term enumerate. When we all read, we know that enumerate, when you're saying enumerate, means you're just trying to list out the reason. And they're saying enumerate the reasons why India has distanced itself from the same. Okay, so this is a two-part answer again. Give a brief description of CPEC. So I started my answer with first introducing that how OBOR, because the question is in context of OBOR. So my introduction was actually about OBOR and how it is a policy of China, and how they are actually trying to connect themselves geographically for trade linkages with the entire world, and how the world is coming on board for them. So I introduced my answer with OBOR. Then I moved to the description of CPEC, which is the first part of the question. So China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, moving from Xinjiang to Pakistani port, and and I also tried to draw a little map of India, and I just tried to show how from Chinese side to the Pakistani side what particular route is coming up. See, drawing map or diagram is something which you should do only if you have time. You should not compromise on your writing content, because it's just a supplement. So I could just find out very few seconds to just draw it. I said okay, let me draw. Moving out to the enumerating the reasons. There either I felt I should divide it into multiple perspectives. So I said internationally, enumerating the reason. I said internationally, I talked about the issue of Pakistan, how issue of Pakistan and Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir, how that CPEC is also coming in the, it's actually hampering the national integrity of the country and unity of the country. If we are actually recognizing the CPAC, then it is like recognizing Chinese, Pakistani footprints in Kashmir, because one part of it is also passing through that Pakistan occupied Kashmir. So this I think I mentioned there. And I enumerated multiple reasons, how internationally, diplomatically, politically, how it will hamper. And I also tried to give a brief vision of the fact that India also is a very important country in South Asia. So it is important that we maintain our independent opinion. And I also summed up the answer by saying that even India is taking such steps like the INSTC. INSTC is the North-South, International North-South Corridor, how we are also working on the port in Iran. So these two things I also highlighted, how Indian policy is also there to counter such kind of Chinese incursions. Moving on to the 10th question, which is the last 10th marker. Left-wing extremism is showing a downward trend. But it still affects many parts of the country. Briefly explain the Government of India's approach to counter the challenges posed by LWE. See, in this question, you don't have to talk much about LWE. What I felt, the first statement is just a statement, it's not a question. LWE is showing a downward trend, but still affects many parts of the country. And the question I felt was actually briefly explain the Government of India's approach to counter the challenges posed by LWE, and that I felt was the actual question. So in my introduction, what I did, there was a recent report on left-wing extremism that I had read. I'm not sure the source of it, but I read that report, and it was a government report, which actually recognized that now there's a downward trend in LWE, and there are only specific hotspots in which the LWE could be found. So what I did in the introduction, I briefly mentioned that what is left-wing extremism in a single statement, and then I tried to elaborate how it is on the downward trend. I also drew the map of India to mention the remaining hotspots of left-wing extremism. For example, here at the border of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, and Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, these are some of the, even later in that report, it is even in southern India, more towards the southern side, the left-wing extremism, new shoots are coming up there. So I just drew the map of India and showed how it is there on downward trend, but they are taking newer places now. Now moving directly to the question, briefly explain the Government of India's approach. Now talking about Government of India approach, I talked about it at multiple levels. Because left-wing extremism, I felt, is a problem which has to be treated at multiple levels. It's not just about the government, not just about the security side. So I opened up with security because security is the most important aspect. I opened up with security, told what kind of, for example, forces are posted there, how they are tackling the issue, how there is a separate, a separate force which is trained to work in interior tribal districts. That is the security part of it, that it comes under the Ministry of Home Affairs, the Government of India's approach. Then I also tried to mention the development approach that the Government of India is taking. Development approach. In the development approach, there are certain examples in LWE, like certain police officers are helping the children in those areas to go to these schools. They are building roads there. So those little examples I felt could add flavor to the answer. So I mentioned them here, development, security. Another thing, I read about something called as Samadhan. See, this was a doctrine that the Ministry of Home Affairs came out with specifically in the context of left-wing extremism, and I felt this was the place where I should be mentioning it. So Samadhan, each of the word has one or the other meaning, like case for actionable intelligence, dashboard based indicators, all of this, each and every letter has a full form of its own. So I just at the end I just mentioned Samadhan, that this is the overall Government of India's approach, and that is how Government of India is trying to move forward with it.